So our next session this morning is entitled New Tools, Progress, and Challenges. We have Margot Brandenburg that is actually replacing Anthony Buglivine this morning, and she's going to be moderating this session. And then next to her is Beth Richardson, and Beth is the director of GEARS, and she's going to be replacing Andrew Kasoy this morning. And both of them will do an impeccable job as they are both leading sort of their worlds and have been a part of this conversation for a very long time. Next to Beth, you guys heard from Joe. He does not need another introduction, but Joe with Apex that will be talking about Pulse. And then finally we have the wonderful Sarah Gelfand from the GIN that's going to be talking about Iris.
Thanks, Lindsay. Morning, everyone. As Lindsay said, I am not Anthony Buglivine. I don't think I look like him. For those of you that know him or know me, you'll know that I'm less inspirational and less provocative, which could be a good or a bad thing. But I do work closely with him, and I do probably know as much about the initiatives that we're going to hear from today. And I certainly probably exceed his appetite for details. I am one of the people that Randall mentioned who does not balk at the prospect of spending 2 days talking about social metrics, and I may be the only person in our team at Rockefeller that I can say that for. So it is a pleasure to be here with the three of you. I should say this is a trifecta that I'm somewhat familiar with, although, as Joe mentioned, the role of Pulse representative used to be played by our colleagues at Acumen. So if I call you Brad or Brian or Mark, please forgive me. It's a learning curve that I'm accelerating through. But I think we're going to structure this panel as more of a conversation. We've asked the panelists not to prepare PowerPoints and not to prepare speeches, but just really jump into some Q&A. And I have some questions, but then I'd like to obviously engage the audience and bring in your questions as well. But just to start, I think I'll say a couple of short words about the genesis of these tools, at least from Rockefeller's perspective, and also just show you a quick sort of view from 30,000 feet about the three of them, and then we'll just move into questions. So for those of you who may not know, about 2 years ago, Rockefeller launched an initiative on our program side focused on accelerating the development of the impact investing industry. For us, impact investing is the placement of capital into companies, fund structures, other intermediaries that are designed to provide a social and/or an environmental as well as a financial return. And so impact investing, at least as we've focused on it, has implied more of a focus on the supply side of capital. So less specifically the entrepreneurs, but either the fund managers or really our sort of sweet spot of focus is on the institutional asset managers that are deploying capital often through fund managers like those who are ANDE members. And for us, SGB Finance is one, what we would call a sector vertical within a broader ecosystem or industry, which is inclusive of things like microfinance, like clean tech finance, like increasing the education, agricultural finance, and what have you. But we have worked closely with ANDE, and we think that there's certainly a lot of healthy overlap, as well as some areas of difference or difference in focus. But in leading up to the decision, our board's decision to approve a 3-year initiative on impact investing, we asked the question, what can we do, or can we do anything, and if so, what is it, to enable more capital to flow more efficiently and more impactfully into investments that can bring solutions at scale to the world's most pressing problems. And we believe that capital is a critical complement to government and to traditional philanthropy, not a substitute for it, but that if we're really to address the most critical problems of our time at scale, it needs to involve the capital markets. So what role, if any, could we play in usefully accelerating that? And at this point, we've probably posed that question to more than 1,000 people who are at various places in that capital supply chain. And surprisingly, to some people, the most recurring answer was some version of social metrics. You can take care of the impact metrics, the social metrics problem. Thanks for that very detailed remit. And so we unpacked it because that's obviously a term or a concept that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And the way that it was unpacked, okay, let me see if I can. Okay. Whew, okay, there we go. So the answers to that broad question can fall into sort of three categories, each of which has a manifestation in one of the tools that's going to be discussed now. There is a clear need for reporting standards, for some definitional underpinnings, sort of analogous to the role that IASB or IFRS plays for non-financial metrics, so for social and environmental and some operational terms. And that began a process which has since been institutionalized in IRIS, which Sarah is going to tell us more about. Other sort of players in the system, and particularly fund managers and other intermediaries that are aggregating up data, had a real focus for a real need for a management information system, something that allows them to collect as easily and as least onerously as possible, as Steve described, a set of standardized metrics across some cases very large number of enterprises. And that need is responded to by Pulse, which Joe already talked about and which we'll discuss more. And the third, and particularly a need that was articulated by investors, less so my colleagues in the foundation world, but more so more commercial investors who have somewhat of a lighter touch approach to their sort of theory of change, wanted a rating system. They wanted a bunch of underlying metrics to be aggregated up into some 1 through 5 star, platinum, gold, silver, something that some credible third party could say would differentiate sort of degrees of order of magnitude of impact. And that led to a process, a business planning process, and ultimately the incubation of GEARS, the Global Impact Investing Rating System. And so the good news is that those three things have been developed, closely in coordination with one another. The good news is that they've been developed in coordination with one another. The bad news is that, or the challenge at least, is that they often get confused for one another. And people say, but there's GEARS, so why do we need IRIS? Or I'm doing IRIS, so what's Pulse? And so we've been looking for like the killer graphic that would help position these things in relation to one another. And unfortunately, we don't have an iPad to offer as a prize. And so I should say the incentives have not been quite the same. But our colleagues at the Global Impact Investing Network, or the GIN, sort of took a stab at it, and that is what you see here. And so a caveat, if this is more confusing than helpful, then please ignore it. And more importantly, please feel free to suggest an alternative. But you'll see sort of at the bottom, you've got IRIS as the sort of definitional building blocks. And you see it again at the top, because IRIS is both a reporting standard and potentially a data repository or warehouse. I will not say the letters XBRL, just so as to avoid Randall's sort of mockery at lunch. But in any event, in between those two sort of, the very most fundamental building blocks and the ultimate sort of industry benchmarking aggregation, we see that the data are intermediated in some cases through a management information system like Pulse, and that's particularly for those that are operating at the sort of fund manager level who are collecting data directly from portfolio companies, and or through a rating system like GEARS, which is asking a set of questions that are based on IRIS compliant definitions and potentially go beyond IRIS and sort of layer on an algorithm that then boils down to, again, a star rating system. And so if this doesn't do anything to elucidate, then please feel free to ignore and just listen to these guys. And hopefully, after an hour, the distinctions and the relationships between them will be clear. Okay, so... Oh, okay. So I'm going to leave this one up in case at some point you get confused about... Oh, shoot. So the challenge of this is that it does move, so when you put, okay, there we go. So if at any point during the conversation you get confused about which one is which, please feel free to refer to this. Otherwise, I think we should dive into questions. So Sarah, maybe I'll start with you. It would be great to hear about why we need standards and what IRIS does to respond to that need.
Sure. So I think you said a lot of the reasons why we need standards that you heard in your research, and that has been reinforced as since October I've had the honor of taking over the stewardship of this framework, and really it's because if people aren't tracking things using a consistent set of terminology, and or if there aren't consistent common metrics that people report, then it's quite hard to look across investments and make informed decisions about where to place capital. And furthermore, as individual entrepreneurs or funds, it's quite hard to look at how you're doing in the context of anything bigger than your own such situation to see what targets mean and how your performance could be more broadly interpreted.
Thank you. Joe, could you talk about how Pulse includes IRIS and what else besides being a tool for promulgating IRIS Pulse does? And sorry, this is somewhat what you covered already, but
no, that's fine. That on? Yeah. So the interesting thing about the Pulse solution is that I think there's a bit of a chicken and an egg in that you want to measure what is unique about what you're doing, and you want to be able to be flexible, and you want to be able to report back your unique value proposition with these analytics. But at the same time, you want to participate in a larger community of people who all call gallons of clean water, and we want to be able to compare our gallons of clean water to your gallons of clean water, and whether it's a competitive benchmark or whether it's an aggregation for overall impact, you have these competing desires to do that. So Pulse is it's an add-in to Salesforce. It's a very well-designed set of data structures that the first thing you do is you get Salesforce, and then you add Pulse into Salesforce, and all of this information is openly available and available to nonprofits if they want to adopt. And then the third thing you do is you load in the IRIS taxonomy of a subset of the IRIS taxonomy, right? We picked about 140 definitions that were the best starting point for people who wanted to begin doing metric collection using Pulse and be IRIS compliant all at the same time. So Pulse is this thing that you can type numbers into monthly, quarterly, annually. You can roll them up across your portfolio of investments or across disparate portfolios. Some of you may have a water portfolio versus an education portfolio versus a microfinance portfolio. It doesn't have to be completely homogeneous like the spreadsheets you're probably using now, where if you want to aggregate those spreadsheets, you've either got a brutally laborious process of picking numbers off where they land, or the spreadsheets need to be identical. How many people have that sort of thing going on in their organization where there you go. And that's cool that you can do that with spreadsheets, but Pulse breaks that down and says, hey, we're going to be a little bit more organized about how we consider the number that is, dollars per student. That number is going to get captured in a way where we can use it across reporting periods, across projects, aggregate that data up into an IRIS aggregator, or provide it to a rating system where that number is data. It's not just a cell in some spreadsheet that may get changed or not auditable. I thought that was a very interesting question about owning the data and the notion of tying it into this being an auditable solution. Pulse and through the power of the Salesforce platform really gives you a defensible situation that say, hey, these are my metrics. This is when I collected that data. This is when I revised that data. All of that stuff is baked into what Pulse is.
thanks, Joe. And so, Sarah, just to be clear, is Pulse the only management information system that can be used to collect IRIS metrics?
No, good question. I mean, you can collect IRIS in any format. It's really a set of definitions, and if you want to track full-time employees or number of customers served in a spreadsheet or in Pulse, that's your prerogative, or if you want to just store it in a Word document. one of the benefits of Pulse is that it makes it easy to both track the data and submit it to this repository, and so to contribute to this industry-wide database that will enable benchmarks and just better market intelligence about our community. And right now, Pulse is the flagship partner for IRIS from a technology point of view, but there are probably other technology systems that are specific to, for example, microfinance or other communities that might be interesting opportunities for embedding the IRIS definitions, much like we've done with Pulse. But today, you can use IRIS in your own internal legacy systems or reporting systems or whatever they may be, or Pulse.
Thank you. So, Beth, how does Gears relate to IRIS and to Pulse? Does it relate to IRIS and to Pulse? And if so, how, and what else does it do?
So IRIS is actually a key component of the Gears rating system.
Can everyone hear Beth?
I can lean forward a little bit. In that our goal is that all of the terms that we use in the rating system be IRIS compliant, which hopefully makes going through a Gears rating process easier for the entrepreneur, in that if we're using standard definitions and they're being asked from all parties to report on a standard definition, then they're not having to provide data in a duplicate form or a slightly different form. And so the first piece of integration with IRIS is in the actual ratings. Like Joe mentioned, we've also heard a need from investors, both for companies and funds to be able to have a standard rating, but also to be able to tell their own story. And so on the ratings reports, there's an opportunity for a company or fund to explain what their particular mission is, and then essentially choose metrics that they feel support that mission. And so with that, similar to Pulse, the plan is to have kind of the IRIS indicators and then kind of choose your own metrics beyond that companies or funds could fill in as part of their ratings process. In terms of integration with Pulse, at this point, that's aspirational, but is clearly seen as a need going forward, so that we can eliminate the need for the double entry of data. We're building our data platform. It's still in early phases, but it looks like we will work with a Salesforce platform. And so given that Pulse and the analytical tool that we build will be on a similar platform, that makes that integration easier in the future.
So theoretically, I could be a fund manager that's using Pulse that wants to get a rating, both for my fund, which means getting each of my portfolio companies rated and having those company ratings aggregated up, as I understand it, into a fund level rating. And then if I do that because, say, some of my investors, like Rockefeller, require it of me because they need to see a rating in order to meet their own sort of social fiduciary obligations, then you could share that data with the IRIS data aggregation tool, so that I don't need to get rated and then separately submit my data to IRIS if I want to participate in industry benchmarks.
That is the vision. That's what we're all moving forward, and it's a logistical issue of getting Pulse and IRIS and Gears to work together. But the plan is that Gears will be a data provider to IRIS, and so we'll be contributing the ratings data as part of the benchmarking data that becomes available in IRIS.
Are there any questions about sort of that, just okay.
Here we go.
Let's not get completely bogged down on logistics, only because there are some sort of meta level questions that I think we should also elucidate. But Camilla, as someone who's close and might be seeing a way that we're not explaining this.
Well, I just have a question. I'm Camilla Seth also from the GIN, and it's a question for Beth. You mentioned that companies that are being rated will have the ability to select. Oh, thank you.
Hi, so I'll start over. Camilla Seth from the GIN. Question for Beth. You mentioned that the companies will be able to select the indicators that they want to be part of their rating. To what extent are you going to, perhaps by industry, suggest a core set that are required, that you intend to consistently evaluate because they are the most important indicators in a given sector, for example?
So I'd say that that there will be metrics that are required that are part of the rating system itself, and that over time we will continue to roll out industry addenda that have specific questions for your industry the vision right now is that these choose your own metrics really will be choose your own metrics. One differentiation I want to point out, though, is that the rating has an assurance process associated with it, and that will be reviewed and audited. The choose your own metrics piece is for investor information, but will not be part of the component that has the assurance process attached to it.
And I think just to be clear, Gears is responsive. I mean, you pointed out that investors often say they want both a standardized methodology for capturing the impact across, in some cases, a very heterogeneous group of company and fund investments. So some kind of overarching framework that allows you to compare one to the other and to sort of situate them, let's say, along an axis, but then also the ability to tell stories or to hear stories. And Gears is responsive to that first piece, the need for a standardized overarching methodology for assessment. And it's really Iris that's more responsive to wanting to provide, let's say, fund managers or entrepreneurs directly to tell a story using common language. So it sort of gives you the words, but not the sentences, or that's maybe not the right analogy. But Gears is less focused on that second piece, right? It's just sort of working in conjunction with Iris.
Gears ratings are a vehicle to be able to tell that story because of the integration with Iris will be the basis for where those metrics are coming from. But it's a way to communicate your own story through the ratings platform. The core component of the Gears rating will continue to be the rating itself.
Other clarifying questions? Rafi in the back. Oh, sorry. I'm totally taking your job.
Susan from SBC Global Advisors. I had a question about Gears, very simple. What is the expectation for the scale and the adoption of Gears and, the approach, spreading the word, and et cetera?
I'm sorry, I just want to limit this for a second to logistical questions about the relationship and then move into some of the sort of like vision, where are we going? And if you don't mind, I think that's a critical question that we should turn to in just a minute. But first, I just want to get out any sort of clarifying, how does one relate to the other? Are there any more questions?
Yeah, Jennifer Cobb from the Global Philanthropy Forum. Just a follow-up question to this one. When you say choose your own metric, are you giving them a predefined list that's Iris compliant, or are they defining their own metric in a sort of hodgepodge way?
So it is much similar to the way that Pulse is set up, where the Iris compliant definitions will be available. But if the definition that they report on isn't in the Iris taxonomy, then there is an option to create your own metric that you're currently
So this is
tracking.
a way of extending Iris potentially, or these
It may
just
be a
become
leading
kind of
indicator for Iris, in that if we start seeing a lot of metrics being reported upon, it may be something that then feeds into Iris over time.
Okay. And then one other question, which is when you talked about this repository, industry-wide repository, where does that live?
I can take that. It lives at the GIN, and it has been built and tested with a handful of pilot organizations who both went through the process of adopting their existing data collection processes to becoming Iris compatible or consistent with the Iris definitions, and then sharing that data into this bigger repository. And really what it means is it's a technology platform that was built by Hitachi with PricewaterhouseCoopers that can take data in a number of different formats. So it can take it in files spit out from Pulse, it can take it in Excel files, and as Margot said, she wouldn't say, I will say it can take it in XBRL, which is a different conversation. And then it compiles those different data sets, and we'll be able to produce in time, when we have enough data, hopefully robust benchmarks. And one of the things I'll just say quickly that we're doing now to load test or prove the concept of this platform is working with an organization called the Microfinance Information Exchange, which has data for 1,400 MFIs, and we will be able to have all that current extensive microfinance data in our system to test that it is that robust industry benchmarking platform.
And so would that data repository be like a Dun & Bradstreet, let's say, or is there an analogy that?
So the data in the repository will be anonymous, and people, I hope, will feel more comfortable contributing and sharing to this public good and this idea of a collective industry data set because it will be anonymous. But in order to manage the integrity of the data, we are going to ask that users submit a unique ID for the organizations that they're, or they'll have to tell us the company name so we can apply an ID so that we can manage with some integrity the data that's coming from different organizations.
So actually, let me ask, if it's okay, a few questions, and then we'll maybe move into some more audience questions. Beth, do you want to start with Susan's questions? What has been your greatest surprise in terms of the take-up of Gears among investors?
I guess before I go directly to that, I just want to mention that the Gears rating system is powered by the B Impact rating system, which is a rating system that was developed by B Lab, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to create a new sector of the economy that's focused on businesses that create social environmental impact. And this rating system has been in use for over 3 years to certify B corporations. And to date, over 6,000 companies have utilized the rating system, whether that be to become a certified B corporation or whether that be to just benchmark their own social environmental performance.
6,000, not 600?
6,000. There's 300 certified B corporations.
I was lopping off a zero when I said that.
No, but there's 6,000 companies that have access to the rating system. And so we have seen companies use the rating system for a number of purposes to date. And it is something that we've made open source for companies to be able to come on and sign on for access for free. And so there's been, for example, a tax incentive established in Philadelphia that it's combined with a legal framework, means that sustainable businesses in Philadelphia have a tax break. There's been membership associations who've made it a requirement in order to be a part of a sustainable business network. We've seen some discounts associated with companies that perform well on the rating system. And so we have some test cases already in terms of how the rating system has been utilized. In terms of Gears, we're focusing specifically on use of the rating system by investors. I'd say that we've been really pleased by some of the early support that we've been able to garner for Gears. We've had some good fortune to have some people invest in the launch and build out of Gears, and so thankful to Rockefeller for their initial grant, and also thankful for USAID and Prudential and Deloitte, who've come in to provide the other capital that was necessary to really get Gears off the ground. We also have leadership from this space who are really helping us form and inform us on what the rating system needs to look like for companies in emerging markets. And so really pleased to have a number of representatives who are here today serving on our Standards Advisory Council. Also pleased to have a number of people who've joined our Gears Advisory Committee with representatives from JP Morgan and Bank of America and Prudential, who kind of are advising us from the investment perspective what it is that they would like to see out of the company and the fund ratings. In terms of uptake, we are definitely in early days. We have a public launch planned for Q1 of 2011. Prior to that, we are having a beta test, which again, a number of ANDE funds are participating in, which means that starting in the fall, 12 funds who have really taken a leadership position in standing out and saying that they would be willing to take part of this process, will ask the portfolio companies in their portfolios to take the rating system and get a Gears rating. The fund rating is then based on a roll-up of the aggregate companies in that fund's portfolio. One kind of touch point we have for investor use is with an investment association called Investor Circle, which is based in the US, and it's essentially an angel network of investors who want to invest in companies that have a triple bottom line. And they've made the Gears rating a requirement of all the companies that present at their venture fairs. Now we're using the US version that we already have in existence, that we use to certify B corporations for these conferences, so we've already been able to do some kind of early testing prior to the official launch of Gears. In this past conference, all the entrepreneurs were required to get this rating, and then had their ratings reports available at the conference. And we've had some really good response post that conference, where we've seen an investor call and say, I have another investment that I'm looking to, can you review their social environmental performance before I make this investment? We've also had a fund manager come to us and say, I know you've done the investment, I've seen the report, but I want to see the underlying data. Can you provide the survey information so I can see all the data points before I think about making this investment?
Interesting. Thank you. So switching gears, Joe, I know Pulse has been now installed at several early adopters, and so what's been most surprising to you about that process and about the process of take-up and implementation?
New software is always fascinating. And probably the most interesting thing about getting started with Pulse is getting people into the mindset of don't fight the tool. And I say this a lot in conversations with tech guys as well. As a matter of fact, CJ and I were just talking about this morning about wiki sites. Is, if you get really wrapped around the axle on, gosh, I want that letter to spin around backwards when I click here, you'll spend all day trying to solve a problem that's really not that crucial to your mission. And what's been refreshing in the Pulse space is that people are hungry for this metric technology, and so we come along and deliver the Pulse solution, which is not perfect or complete or any of that stuff. Pulse is a framework for being able to collect this data and report on this data, but you got to want it. I don't want to kid you. We'll say that you can install this thing in an hour, and you can. And you can even be using it in an hour, and in 5 minutes you'll be over there collecting Pulse metrics. But you got to want it, because running the reports, and you've got to have somebody who cares in the organization enough to look at the data. I thought the comment about own the data again. You got to have a metrics manager that cares enough about this stuff, where the fact that I can't get my portfolio company to type in 12 numbers once a month is not a barrier to collecting those metrics. We're talking about 12 numbers once a month. You can type them in, people. Sort of getting people into this mindset of the technology doesn't have to do it all. What it needs to do is provide the framework for, wow, if 40 of the people in this room decide to do the iris taxonomy and Pulse, and all of a sudden we can feed that into Gears immediately, boy, it doesn't take us providing every single feature that everybody wants. It doesn't take every single organization doing it exactly the same way. It just takes a little bit of momentum around these things to get the thing where all of a sudden, hey, wait a second, there's now enough data, there's now enough mass to this thing that you can do it. So I think probably the most surprising thing is that people get hung up lots of times on little things, and if you can get people over the, gosh, I wish it worked slightly differently. I wish I didn't have to have a Salesforce account. Okay, that's fair. Bringing in new technology is sometimes a pain, but we've trimmed Pulse down so that you can adopt just the Pulse portion of Salesforce if that's really all you want. We would encourage you to use the rest of it, but don't let the technology be the problem here, because there are lots of much harder problems to solve around your metrics and monitoring and evaluation program. Conserve your energy and make it easy and adopt a tool that just works.
Thank you. Sarah, I guess same question. What has been most surprising to you about the response to Iris, and maybe what's the greatest challenge you see as you go forth with it?
Okay. I guess the surprise has been the receptiveness, and I think Steve and Veronica said in the beginning this momentum behind it. And when I first came into this role, or as I was thinking about coming into this role, I was talking to Anthony, who's not here, and he said, why do you want to do this? So many efforts have failed, and people have been doing this for a long time, and what makes you, confident that this is something worth taking a job doing? And I didn't really know exactly how that was going to play out, but what has been amazing since I have come into this role, and many people in this room and many people outside of this room have spent a long time thinking about these kinds of things, and many of them have been incredibly generous and supportive with their time and their contributions of resources to help shape this and contribute to what I think is going to be something that the industry really can use and lean on, and also people's patience. I mean, Iris's evolution will be iterative, and I'm thinking about people who have been part of our working groups and who have worked with me in the spirit of harmonizing a lot of disparate frameworks and recognizing that it won't happen overnight, but in time, and a contribution or a commitment to, sticking it out through that process in the spirit of doing this for the industry is something that I've been really overwhelmed by. And then just on the adoption side, the GIN sits in New York and has a vision of IRIS being a global standard, and I've had the pleasure of having opportunities to travel quite a bit in the past several months, and I'm continuing to be surprised how often people are aware of and using IRIS outside of sort of the core audience I work with every day. And just as an example, I was at a conference in India, and after I was speaking about IRIS, a woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm using IRIS with one of my clients. I'm teaching her how to use the IRIS metrics." And so I actually think that the power of technology and the voice of this group that extends into corners of the world much broader than here means that this really can be a global standard. As far as challenges, there are many, but I'll just say that finding the right indicators to something you all were talking about at the beginning about practical things to measure and meaningful things to measure. I think there's a reason why this has been something people have been working on for a long time. It's really hard. And especially one other point I just want to make is that IRIS is really a meta standard that supports indicators within many different industries, and so trying to glean out and think about things that are comparable or common across the heterogeneous set of constantly innovating players in this universe is hard. But one that, like I said, to the strengths and the reinforcement is something I hear all the time people continuing to work towards.
And your story about meeting someone in India that was working with portfolio companies to report out on IRIS sort of reminds me of the meta issue that Veronica touched on, which is audit, and short of audit, even just basic quality assurance. Can you talk about the role of audits and or some just sort of more basic quality assurance mechanisms, and are they a part of any of these three things? And maybe I'll start with Beth and go down the line, because I think it's a question for everyone.
So assurance is a key component for the credibility of Gears, because essentially it's a self-reporting tool that companies are providing data about their social environmental performance. And so without any assurance process, the ratings could become meaningless quite quickly. And so there's a kind of several steps in the assurance process. The first is that there are documents that are required for the company to submit. And so we are asking for documentation on material questions within the rating system. So for example, if a company says they have an environmental policy, we would ask to see that environmental policy. Those will then have a desk review where they're reviewed to make sure that we've actually gotten the right materials from the company and that they meet the criteria. And then there's...
So it's 100% of companies will have a desk review. 100% of companies
will have a desk review. Okay. And then 100% of companies will also have a assessment review with a member of the Gears team who goes through each question in the rating system and makes sure that the company was answering them in the spirit that they were intended. And then above and beyond that, 10% of all companies will be subject to a random audit. And so that means that a person will come to the company and review the documentation and interview staff to make sure that what the company is saying is happening is actually happening.
And who does that audit of those 10% of companies?
It is something that we are still working out. We are in conversations with Deloitte at this point to be the primary assurance provider for Gears. We also have experience in-house with the audit process in that for the B certification process, which is the other kind of program that B Lab runs, we've been auditing B corporations, which are, I think I mentioned before, but they're companies that are based in the U.S. that excel in social environmental performance.
Thanks. Joe, is there a role for audit or quality assurance in Pulse?
I think there's a huge role. It brings me back to, I think, the first time we met Sarah. I was sitting in the Rockefeller office, and it was at the beginning of our tenure as the Pulse manager, and we were talking about how we were going to do these integrations between Pulse and IRIS. And I got all techie and, oh yeah, we web services and this stuff's gonna be flying in and out of everybody's systems automatically, and nobody's gonna have to touch it. And Sarah said, yeah, we talk a lot about data quality, and and all of a sudden the light bulb went on for me that this is not as easy as counting the change in the cash register at the end of the day. These are complicated numbers that require, in the short term, they require the human eye to analyze this data and to know whether the number that's being reported faithfully with good intentions is rational. So when you get a number, is it a real number? Fast forward a couple of years, when we're successful with all of this, all of a sudden we will start to be able to apply a little bit of technology to this, and Gears is going to have enough fund ratings and enough portfolio company ratings to be able to start using a little bit of technology intelligence around outliers. We've already got a situation with the early adopters of Pulse where more than one Pulse entity is invested in the same portfolio company. Wow, that's really interesting. You reported 112 employees to this person and 170 employees to that person. So let's let the technology start doing some of the work for us on the quality assurance side. The problem is you can't start from that perspective with these tools. The human eye early on is really important, and as much as it pains me to say, there's a little bit of fake automation here that goes on in this quality assurance business in the beginning. And what I mean by fake automation is all of you working very hard to make sure that the numbers are right. And that quality assurance role, I think, in order for that aggregator to really be filled with good information, and in order for me to trust the ratings of that fund manager, I've got to have confidence in the numbers that built that up. And I think if you look back to the Wall Street situation that we made reference to, I don't blame the rating agencies for the ratings per se. I blame them for not understanding the financial risk of the investments that they were rating. They sort of didn't do the fake automation on what's the black swan, how could this thing unwind. So really understanding what goes into it now at the beginning is going to be great, and then technology will be able to assist more later.
Thanks. Sarah, what about you? What about IRIS? Is there a role for quality assurance? Is it feasible?
Yeah, there's obviously a role. I think part of why the integration you mentioned at the beginning between Gears and IRIS is really exciting is because we will, in that case, already be able to benefit from audited sort of quality assured data. And part of why, as ANDE members, we hope that through your working with Lindsay, there'll be another sort of set of quality assurance measures just from a, I guess, high level, no anomalies or really funky things in the data point of view. I think in the near term, that level of multiple eyes, as Joe mentioned, looking at the data and the human perception is the reality. I think part of why we've seen a lot of support from firms like Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers is because there is an acknowledgement that these kinds of measurements are going to become more the norm and be an important set of indicators to report alongside financial indicators in the future. And so I think part of this is building and continuing on the momentum that has already been built to demonstrate the demand signals that suggest that formal auditing practices need to come into play, tailored for certain context, but that they need to exist. And so we hope that this use of IRIS by all of us in this room and beyond will gen some of those demand signals.
Just a perspective, Joe, to your point about sort of the data not being like change in the cash register, I was at the Microfinance Information Exchange when it was spun out of a donor consortium called CGAP 8 or 9 years ago now, and Sarah mentioned them. There's a good, I think, collaboration underway. But the mix was really clear to say that all the data were self-reported. There was no process of audit or verification or rating. And yet, in order for that to not be garbage in, garbage out, we needed analysts to sit there and look at the data from each MFI and just to say, your assets grew 500% year on year and your staff went down by 50%. Those two things, they're theoretically possible, theoretically both could be possible, but it's unlikely. And so then you go back to the reporting company and the MFI and say, look, is this true, or did you, enter an extra 0 by accident. And so all of that, which still falls short of any sort of credible, verification standard, is costly. And so just as a funder in this space, as an entity that really wants to see some of these public goods and pieces of industry infrastructure emerge, it's really challenging to know that even some of the more basic processes are actually a lot more laborious and require a lot more funding, essentially, especially in the beginning, than would meet the eye, where you're just saying, oh, self-reported data, that must mean it's just, from one to the other and that's it, right? You just press the button and it all flows, and there's, but it's actually, to have any sort of minimal integrity is a lot more challenging, I think, than people realize. I'm going to take a question from the audience.
Sam Edwards with Emerging Capital Partners. I know Sam Edwards with Emerging Capital Partners. I know for us, one of the biggest drivers for environmental and social and governance metrics has been the development finance institutions, the IFC, Proparco, CDC, and I was wondering what the role and relationship between IRIS and Pulse and GEARS has been.
Sarah, you want to take that? Thank you.
Sure. I don't know if she's in the room, but there's a woman here from IFC who, the IFC in general has played a role in the governance of the IRIS framework.
I see her back there.
Okay. I don't want to put her in the spot, but anyway, and I think to the comment I made earlier about a process of evolution, that the IFC has built a really great tool, for example, DOTS for tracking its own performance, and I think there's a lot that IRIS can incorporate from DOTS and other multilaterals with similar systems that can shape the framework. And in time, I think there's a vision that the standards will be harmonized and that what IRIS represents will be consistent with the multilateral tools as well. It's just some of it takes time.
And yes, okay, please go ahead.
My name is Ross Baird. I'm with Gray Ghost Ventures, and we have a lot of interest in-house in using the IRIS framework to measure our impact, using Pulse as a tool to be able to measure it, and reporting it to the GEARS. How's that for following your buckets? All right, so we're on the right track so far. I will say, particularly with our social venture investing, the most common question that our fund managers have, which I want to forward to y'all, is we've got consumer goods like solar-powered lights. We've got mobile phone application companies. We've got, and we can't, our fund managers can't even think of 10 standards that apply between those two companies, let alone all across our portfolio. So with our group particularly, we've got a lot of different enterprises with a lot of different twists. So our biggest question is probably, how do we take a very diverse portfolio and standardize it? I'd be interested in what your answer is.
So I'll start that from the GEARS side, is that the rating system that we're developing is tracked for industry, sector, and company size. So depending on information you put in your profile, you actually see an adaptive rating system. It's comparable, so that the score you see at the back end is comparable across sector, industry and size, but that it recognizes that there are differences in companies and that you're not asking the same metrics for every company. So an example of this is, I think it's especially clear around the environment, that you may be a services company, you may be a wholesale company, or you may be a manufacturing company, and that your environmental footprint is different based on those sectors. And so for services firms, we're asking a lot more about their office operations. With a manufacturing firm, we're asking a lot more about their actual footprint and what their supply chain is doing, and then what the manufacturing operations is creating in terms of environmental impact. We know that this is going to be a journey over time. One of the things that we introduced in version 2.0 of the rating system was industry addenda. And so essentially we started asking specific questions about industries that replace kind of a generic one-size-fits-all products and services section. So over time, we will be gaining to greater granularity in terms of being able to ask questions that are industry-specific.
Ross, just an answer. Rockefeller is also an investor through our program-related investment portfolio, albeit a smaller and less sophisticated investor than Grey Ghost. But and we also try to practice what we preach by using all of these tools. I can come back to Pulse in a second. But for us, at least, there's a very heterogeneous portfolio that we invest in. It's across sectors and regions, but then there's some clusters of investments. And so, for example, we have 3 or 4 investments in sort of community development venture capital funds in the U.S. And so for those, they're tracking relatively similar metrics, at least in theory. And what we realized is when we peeled underneath a layer, they're all defining them slightly differently. And so for us, probably the biggest value there is IRIS, is saying, okay, across these 4 funds, what is really sort of best in practice for job creation, for women and minority employment, et cetera. We also need to look across that portfolio and understand how those community development venture capital investments work in relation to some of our international microfinance investments or some of our BOP sort of enterprise investments, some investments in the green job space. And so there, we don't want to sort of incur the brain damage that's necessary to figure out responsibly how do you, put together a meta-level framework that will position those within one overarching sort of framework. And that's where the gears rating and saying, okay, well, they're 3 stars and they're 3 stars and in different sectors and regions, and the underlying methodology has been tweaked for geography and industry and for size of company. But at the end of the day, this is sort of the best thinking that we've found about how you would situate those against one another. And then we can do things like offer better terms to the better performer, so then you can sort of respond to that as an investor as you best see fit, or you can say we're only going to invest 4 stars or above, or what have you. So for us, that's sort of an example of how we would use both. Parenthetically, on Pulse, we're waiting till we most often invest through funds, and so we're waiting for Pulse to be deployed across more of our investees before using Pulse. We don't have so many underlying investments that the data management is probably not the single biggest challenge for us as it is for a number of our investees. So
I'll ping you on that.
Please.
I just wanted
Take
to
me
say,
up on it.
I just wanted to say one thing to Ross about using metrics, and that I think to Beth's point, there are perhaps a few operational things that could be common across, and that it probably doesn't make sense to look at units sold across these kinds of organizations in very different sectors, but there may be common impact objectives across them, like an attribute of their typical consumer socioeconomic status or location, and the IRIS definitions give you a consistent way to frame those questions amongst your different investees so that you're looking at the socioeconomic status of the average customer of these different organizations across these portfolios and asking the same question.
Actually, Sarah's being modest. She's done some great work with a working group that's focused, or it's inclusive of both microfinance and community development finance practitioners. And so it sounds like you're really making a lot of progress in terms of harmonizing the metrics that are collected domestically in the CDFI space and internationally in the microfinance space, where in theory there should be strong parallels, but just in practice there's been some path dependency, and so they both started among different communities and sort of diverged. Is that
Sure, right. So,
true?
I mean, those organizations are common in that they're financial services organizations, but there are a consistent set of financial operations metrics and other aspects of looking at the way they're serving their clients that we're starting to agree as a working group that we can ask in a consistent way.
Joanna, in going around the room, do you mind going back to Susan too? Because I feel like I didn't do justice to her question at some point, so just wanted to not overlook her as you.
I'm okay.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Hi, Nathalie Pinon from Harmony. I just have a quick question for Beth. You spoke about the pilot that you're going to be running. How many? You're working specifically with funds.
Mm-hmm.
How many, and sort of where are they geographically based, and what size investments do they make?
Sure. We will likely have about 25 Pioneer Gears funds. 12 of those are investing in companies that are in the emerging markets, and 13 of those are investing in the US or Canada. In terms of the emerging markets, we see a cluster in Central America, we see a cluster in East Africa, and we see a cluster in India, and also in Southern Africa and West Africa, but those are the largest concentrations. In terms of investment size, it's either early stage or growth capital. And there's a variety of both equity and debt that are going into those companies.
So I have a question, and then maybe I'll go back to one from the audience. What do you need from the folks in this room, from ANDE members and ANDE allies, other than just maybe taking up the tool? But what do we need to get everyone working towards a common vision?
For us, this is essentially a process of co-creation. That we have a methodology for rating, but we are in process of developing the version of the rating system that's appropriate for companies in the emerging markets. We have a number of people serving on our Standards Advisory Council who are assisting us in this process. We will also be reaching out to entrepreneurs that are associated with the Pioneer Gears funds this summer to get their feedback prior to the beta test. But we will be launching a public beta in the fall as well, and have kind of technological platform to capture people's feedback. And so that feedback is key to making sure that we're asking the right questions and that we're thinking about the weightings in the right way, and so that we can kind of crowdsource to arrive at the right answer, or approaching the right answer in terms of how to rate these companies, which is incredibly complex. And so really look to people in this room as experts who know what the reality is on the ground, what's feasible, and then what is right to expect in terms of social environmental performance of the entrepreneurs in a kind of a diverse marketplace.
Sarah, Joe, any thoughts?
Well, it feels a little self-serving. I mean, we would love all of you to adopt Pulse. We would love, and I guess I'm in a slightly funny spot here because we are not a nonprofit. We're a consulting firm and a software shop, and so we need a sustainable business model around Pulse. So the hope here is can't talk to all of you for 4 hours today. The truth is we can't implement all 120 of you over the course of over the summer either. So one thought is to think about the options for adopting Pulse for an organization here are, you can do this yourself. We're providing enough information for any organization that feels like they are technically savvy, don't have a million wacky requirements. You can do this stuff yourself, and if you're that sort of an organization, get on our wiki site and figure out how to get Pulse installed and have fun with it, and we're there to support you as best we can as a free Pulse adopter. And then we have two other options. We can do a short consultation with organizations. We do a 3-hour tour style thing, so if you just need a little bit of hand-holding to get started. And then the last piece is full-on implementations, which we're trying to do, back to my story a little bit, stay in the center of the road a little bit, and we can get more of you up and going, and we can start crowdsourcing enhancements and further development of the platform, all that cool web services stuff, which we're going to do as soon as we've got enough data in there. That'll come as we're able to address a larger audience. All of a sudden, stuff that was hard to develop for 1, 2, or 5 customers becomes a lot easier for 50 customers. So that's the hope with Pulse. And we'd love it to be the beginnings of a little bit of crowdsourcing on this stuff. Get enough people using one thing, and then all of a sudden ideas can be turned and implemented and seen. The effect of a new idea or a new thought can be tested much more broadly, much more quickly.
So what you're saying is those of us who have some comfort with technology internally can go online and do it ourselves, and the Luddites among us can call you and figure out how you can help us.
I had a fascinating conversation. Maybe the most surprising conversation I've had getting involved in your space a little bit was with another very, very large foundation, and the quote goes something like, we have more money than time, and we have problems to solve. So we need you, you, Joe, to come in here and fix this, and we'll give you our expertise, but the technology problem is yours to solve. So grade yourself on that continuum of do you want to solve this with money, or do you want to solve this with energy and time? Let's interface accordingly, and I don't mean that in a bad way. we all want to grow here.
And if we're short on both, the good news is that we're all trying to reduce the amount of time and money that's required to participate. So that's
right.
Okay.
Let's make it easy.
Just checking. Sarah, just same question for you. Is there an ask of the ANDE community that you would make?
Yeah, and so to borrow two terms you guys use, I had in my notes to say co-create and crowdsource, but that.
It's either an echo chamber
I
or it's
know.
a sign that.
But that, so outside of this conference, that through your work with Lindsay, and not to overcommit her, that you will continue to provide us feedback about what is useful in the framework and what's not. And then to make a plug for tomorrow's IRIS sessions, the IRIS staff has done a lot of work to build out use cases to show how the IRIS taxonomy can be applied in different contexts. And I think those sessions will be a wonderful way for each of you to look at what is in IRIS today and what's valuable and what's missing, and so we can really learn together and inform how to make it better. And so, enough said.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Cynthia. I'm with E&Co. It's mostly a question to Sarah. I'm trying to look at you here. Somebody asked before about the relationship to IFC and how that was dealt with. Was there also any consultation process with European development banks? And I ask this because sometimes many of the projects are co-funded, and you got to meet, IFC or MIF or FinFund, a number of different development banks. That was one. And the other question was with whether you said IRIS standards were sector-oriented. Are they also region-oriented?
Great questions. So I think to date, the only multilateral we've really worked with is IFC. I think it's definitely on the horizon to engage others. And I think, not to put it back to this group, but this group has an opportunity also to send the message that we as a community want to use a standard, and this is what we want to use, and can you work with this standard to make it consistent with what your reporting needs are. But I do think in the near term, the onus is on us to figure out how to engage a broader set of multilaterals. To the second point, so the IRIS will be iterative. We will make it better, and I think Margot uses the phrase sometimes less crude over time. And we think our first tack is to, through working groups that are geographically balanced, bring together sector-specific or impact area-specific individuals. In time, we totally anticipate needing to create regionally specific groups, and hope that that will involve the creation of indicators or overlays to indicators that reflect the regional specificity that's not present today.
Can I perhaps say something? My name's Ewan Marshall from the IFC, so I thought I should say something. Firstly, in terms of our sort of collaboration, it's very much sort of, we would like to be part of a journey of learning together. We do have approaches and standards that we've been sort of working on our portfolio over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So we've learned some things along the way, and we've made some mistakes along the way. And I think as we start to think about sort of standards to engage in those conversations is something that we welcome. The challenge, and I think it goes to the gentleman's question around the difference between sort of all of these itty-bitty individual kind of approaches, and how do you scale those, how do you aggregate those to a level which makes sense at a portfolio level, is the real challenge. So on our side, from an implementation perspective, we have our performance standards, drives the Equator principles. It's kind of an approach for how you think about sustainability, how you think about social performance and investment. What we've recently done, and this is something that we're very keen to sort of continue to talk about, is to develop what we're calling our development goals. And these are six indicators across our portfolio, which is at the moment about $35 billion, 6 indicators to tell the story. And how do we think about how we can start to tell a meaningful story with just 3, 4, 5, 6 indicators? Because the challenge is, for each of you individually, it probably doesn't do justice to your story. You're unique, you're individual. And on one level, that's right. But on the other level, particularly if we're talking about investment markets love to have comparisons. And so kind of being unique is interesting, but then it means you can't be compared, which makes it hard to make an investment decision. So from our perspective, we would, we're very open to continuing these conversations, the sort of the joint learning, if you will. I think bringing in our fellow MDBs is a wonderful idea and something that we can certainly help to try and see what we can do to help you with. I actually, since I've got the microphone, had a question. And my question goes to one of scale. And we've talked a little bit about sort of scale. So there's two things. One is economics. So how does it work? I mean, what I've heard is a lot of complexity, a lot of cost, just double checking sort of information. So within the sort of the socially responsible investment world, there's been numerous attempts to set up research businesses which are going to sell into these mutual funds. And it's a real challenge to make money. So how do you see the sort of the payment streams working? Who pays for what and to whom? And secondly, within scale, we're talking about a pilot of 25 funds for gears. What's the sort of what's the goal? Is it 100, 500? How do you see that playing out, over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
Thank you. And maybe let's start with the second question because it's more finite, and then we can let anyone answer the business model question. Do you want to just talk about your 5-year scale vision for gears?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the overarching goal of why we're doing gears, I think there's efficiency and transparency are kind of two core values, and that ultimately we believe that ratings do help play a role in making markets, and that we envision that more capital can come into the space as a result of their ratings product being in existence. That we've talked to investors who say, I don't have the expertise in-house to do social environmental performance. If there was a third-party tool that could help me with that component that I don't have expertise in, I would be more likely to move into this space. And so kind of 5 years from now, we've moved beyond this kind of core group who are the leaders and who have kind of pioneered the space to an ever-expanding group of funds. Right now, we can identify 300 funds that we know of who are focusing on kind of social and environmental performance, but the hope is not to stay without 300, but that all of these infrastructure plays that are being put in place can help grow the pool.
But you have a business plan, and so to the first question, where do you need to be in 5 years so that this is break even? How many investors and fund managers do you think that you need using gears?
And so I guess just to talk to the business model point, trying to learn from the experience of the ratings agencies and the kind of follies that they've found themselves in. We want to construct a system where there's kind of multiple payers into the system. And so companies and funds are paying essentially to cover the assurance costs that are associated with the ratings, and then investors are paying to access a database of aggregate ratings and to utilize those ratings. In terms of break even for us is probably within 4 or 5 years, and you're looking at probably in the range of 150 funds and several approaching at least 1,000 companies at that point.
So you're not going to give 5-star ratings to pools of no-doc mortgages? I'm really disappointed to hear that. It could have been very exciting next few years. Joe, sorry, do you want to say something about the business model for?
Well, I think the business model one is an interesting one, and if you use the rating agencies as kind of the analog here for what you're trying to do, I think that business model has come under a lot of deserved scrutiny. So I think this is a complicated problem to solve, and as a technology guy, I'm going to pass a little bit. The good news is that technology keeps getting better and easier and more powerful, and so you look at some of the crowdsourcing type things. You look at some of the algorithmic stuff that will be able to be applied in here, and I think you got kind of a Googleization of the problem in this audience that didn't exist 500 years ago when rating agencies started. I don't know when they really started, but certainly 100 years ago or 200 years ago when these guys got started, it was all very laborious. So I think just like Google figured out how to detect spam because they control half the email traffic, I think that there's going to be an opportunity for this data to be sanitized, not the right word, sane, rational. I think there's going to be an opportunity for this data to be rational digitally. But then, potentially there's a market for different levels of verification. look, I'm just looking for rational, I want the cheap rating. I'm looking for better, I will pay more for mil-spec sample on the data. I need great, I need the gold standard plan. But again, I'm just a tech guy.
Sarah, is there a business model for IRIS? Are people willing to pay for it? Should they pay for it? What?
I mean, I think standards are inherently a public good, and so there is less of a business model there. I think to the question about this being complex and will people report on this, and I think part of the burden, and Margot, I've heard you talk about this before, of organizations like philanthropists, is to help demonstrate that there are cost-effective, feasible to collect maybe 6, but maybe more output-esque indicators that are proxies for the impact we all hope we're trying to have, so that organizations will be able to collect the things that will allow them to differentiate themselves and maybe have a higher market value or some overall better value for the market, because they're both their financial and their non-financial indicators demonstrate quality, and that there are some feasible ways to showcase that they are doing so.
And so, what if we're tracking the wrong 6? I mean, to the point that Veronica raised about unintended consequences, what if we're all killing ourselves to collect data that don't mean anything, that aren't changing people's lives? What's in place to make sure that we're not just reifying, 6 or however many bad data points? What's being built in? Is anything being built in to protect against that?
I mean, I guess from our perspective is that we see the need for a dynamic rating system, that this is not something that's being created and will look the same from here on out. And so that through that process of dynamism and updating, that over time we're coalescing on, as we learn how to ask better questions, that we're asking better questions, but also as the industry continues to change, that we're capturing what impact means over time.
Yeah, I would say the same thing for IRIS, that it's because it's evolutionary, that today we want performance reporting of these indicators to be more commonplace, and that in time, once people are reporting on some of these basic things, we'll get feedback and understand a little better through research and funding of research what's working, what's not working, what's a good proxy and what's not, and then because it will evolve, the feedback loop will inform what the next set of standards looks like.
And Joe, can Pulse keep up if these things change, or?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Pulse is prepared for the 2.0 taxonomy, which we keep talking about. So looking forward to that. And Pulse will need to evolve. I think there's an interesting opportunity.
Joe, could you say what the 2.0 taxonomy is, in case some people don't?
Not qualified.
Sarah, could you just mention?
Sure, just it's not as scary as that sounds. I know there's we're just the first version of IRIS that was launched, I don't know, roughly this time last year, is in a process of being revised to incorporate feedback from our piloters, from recommendations from working groups, and feedback from a first public comment period. And so we at the IRIS staff at the GIN are working to launch a second version at the end of this summer. And rest assured that if you're using IRIS today, many of the most commonly reported indicators have not changed. And if anything, it should be a more intuitive framework and easier to interpret table of contents, if you will, and some more precision in areas where perhaps there was more needed.
Thank you.
And Pulse, we've been in conversations, and Pulse is aware that it's going to need to evolve. Just as the framework took feedback, Pulse is taking feedback as well. So we know that the technology's got to evolve. But back to this notion of sustainability and all this thing, I wonder if there's not capitalism to the rescue here, in that there's money flowing into the impact investing space that is not philanthropy, that's actually impact capital for I'm willing to take a lower return to get a triple bottom line. And if you're not going to see an influx of people who are more rating sensitive, just like we all look at our Morning Stars and our this, that, and the other, if some of this data is not going to get validated by the market hypothesis that it supports, and that because there will be more small and medium-sized actors trying to do impact-type activities, that you might not see a little bit of shakeout in that, and that you're going to be incented to review harder the quality of your ratings, and I'm going to be incented to make sure that Pulse is gathering that stuff and distributing it faster. So all these new people coming into the impact space are going to drive that.
Just because you mentioned it, I should say Rockefeller and JP Morgan's research unit are just starting a joint research piece to size the market for impact investing. But we do believe that foundation PRI money is a small fraction of the overall pool that is actually currently available, but more importantly will be there within the next 5 years. So just didn't want to miss an opportunity to underscore that. I want to have everyone close by sort of saying what their vision is in 5 years and how their tool fits into it. But before, as everyone's thinking about that, I see Tamsin has the microphone. So.
Thank you. Tamsin Rattler from Nexi. I just wanted to ask a question really of Beth, and partly looking at what Joe's actually just picked up on, and partly the business model. If you look at the rating system, and particularly as more, if you like, mainstream traditional capital starts moving into impact investing, and people wanted to have an elective rating, is the model to go with a Deloitte's a good model, or is something that actually accredits sort of related service providers within the industry? For example, in South Africa, we have to have an empowerment rating. So there's a particular code, and there are now a number of accredited service providers who would then be authorized to give you your empowerment rating, whether it's an A, B+, or whatever. Is that a similar model that could work actually for a Gears? And particularly if you were going towards a social stock exchange, whether it's a Nexi kind of a platform or any of the others that are starting, having that kind of thickening of sort of service providers into that would be useful.
I'd say that's a longer term goal. And just in terms of where we are operationally, there is some advantages to working with a firm, and Deloitte is somebody that we're having conversations with, but that's not the final answer at this point. But that they have a global reach, and so just given our infancy, it has strong benefits to have somebody who can have a global reach. That over time, that we see that, especially on the international side, that there'll be a need to have other providers who are providing the service, and we don't want to also be single sourcing our assurance process because there's also some conflict of interest that's involved with that. So I'd say in our infancy, there's some benefits to having at least one provider who can provide the majority of the services, but that over time you envision to have more providers who are kind of essentially accredited to provide the service.
So is there a cost implication for the social enterprises with Deloitte as a service provider? Is that maybe prohibitive to some of the companies?
So in terms of the
Should
assurance
I repeat the
piece,
question, sorry, because it didn't get.
Sure. She was asking in terms of whether it's prohibitive for the companies to participate. And so the assurance component is something that's built into the cost of the ratings. So it's not something that they're paying when they're informed that they are being audited.
So I'm torn. Lindsay, I defer to you. Harold's got a question. He's one of our fearless leaders. I did want to offer an opportunity for everyone to close with sort of where we want to be in 5 years, but if we have time for Harold before then.
I'll try to make this quick, but I was especially perked up at listening to the idea of the business model. Could you not maybe solve part of your business problem issue and also help us with execution if you provided also a sort of fee for service to people like us that have big and growing portfolios? I'm seeing both for ourselves and ultimately for the people we work with, it's going to be a very big job given that there's a lot else going on. If you could provide an efficient service to help with the execution, for instance, of Pulse, and I would frankly rather pay for that than a lot of the things I do under our technical assistance program. I would have thought that's a way for all three of you to also kind of instill the minimum discipline and whatever it is you're trying to achieve in your systems through such sort of a hit squad of people that could be hired out to help us and our clients with execution. And a lot of this, I think your devil's going to be in the detail, and I don't know where to get that help. I'm noticing there's a big difference from when I had a half dozen projects to do this with to 20 or 25. It gets to be a very big struggle. Have you thought about providing that service?
So on the time-money spectrum, you're shorter, it sounds like, on time maybe, but does anyone want to?
Yeah. Where's Stephen Simic? His ears should be burning. The idea of being able to provide a more well-rounded set of services around this is something that we're certainly looking at as a business model, to be able to help with that in places where it's asked. The idea is it's got to be sustainable for organizations that want to do it themselves, but for organizations that just need it done, yes, it's possible we could be more efficient because we do it all day, every day. We could share best practices, et cetera, et cetera. The difficulty is we sort of wind up being the PwC of all these things. It winds up getting expensive to have the talent that can really do this at the level you expect it to be done. So then you create sort of these strata of fee offerings. But it's certainly something that Stephen would love to have lunch with you and talk about.
Thank you. So could each of you maybe just close us off with some mental picture that you have in your heads for what this all looks like in 5 years, if we're successful or reasonably successful?
Sure. I guess the vision, the 5-year vision, looks like social impact reporting using the consistent IRIS definitions is commonplace within this community, and perhaps the community has grown as well based on the momentum and energy of this community. That all of that consistent reporting and data contribution leads to a set of really robust benchmarks that allows everybody to ultimately perform better because they can see data that allows them to monitor their own performance and become better enterprises or social enterprises and better impact investors, and ultimately, to the point you kicked off with, solve more of these big pressing problems that we're all in the room talking about.
I think our vision here is to follow you to some degree. I mean, we're more of a service provider in this space, so we want to fill the gaps that you identify that you need technology assistance from. So, we'll try and lead in the places where we're expert. Where we'd like to be in 5 years is to be your trusted advisors on these sorts of things. But it really, it's up to you to let us know where you need that assistance and where you see a product like Pulse growing. And we know that integration with IRIS is a big deal. We're guessing that integration. I had a great conversation with your Chief Technology Officer 3 weeks ago, and we sort of agreed that, look, we've got to get our own houses in order here. I got to get a bunch of people going on Pulse. I can't do an integration now first, but I think those sorts of integrations and creating a common platform for you to operate on, where you're not having to enter the same data twice, and you have high confidence in being able to interact with your peers on the quality of that data, is what I'd love to see happen.
I think all of us in this room are motivated to through solving the problems that we see, whether those be poverty, whether that's environmental degradation. So I think for all of us, the end result is really seeing that social change, and that this infrastructure that we're talking about is what's ultimately supporting the funds and the entrepreneurs who are out there doing the work to make that happen. To that end, though, we hope that for companies and funds that we see a more rational fundraising process, that it becomes easier for companies and funds to raise capital from impact investors. There's a lot more transparent and in terms of who those investors are, and for companies and funds that they can raise their visibility through the process of getting a GEARS rating. In terms of what I mentioned before, we also hope that this is something that can help grow the space. And so 5 years from now, we hope that we are moving beyond those who have led in the space and are accessing a larger pool of capital of those who are kind of learning about this space.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to all three of our panelists. Thank you to the audience for questions. I hope that you will all be around for the next 2 days for some one-on-one consultations, and I know there'll be some subsequent sessions that touch on these things. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.